delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India. It is our pleasure to present today Indian Political Thought in the Global Age, Shruti Kapila in conversation with Faisal Devji. A session that examines influential political thinkers that form the foundational roots of modern India while intricately observing their impact on South Asian political thought and action. Academic Shruti Kapila's latest book, Violent Fraternity, Indian Political Thought in the Global Age, explores how a sovereign India's foundational questions of politics were addressed in the shadow of imperialism. In conversation with historian Faisal Devji, she takes a deep dive into the diverse culture, politics, and history of the Indian subcontinent and its resulting impact on the rest of the world. Shruti Kapila is an associate professor of history at the University of Cambridge and is a fellow of Corpus Christi College. Her latest publication, Violent Fraternity, Indian Political Thought in the Global Age, presents a groundbreaking history of the ideas that laid the political foundation of modern India. Her political commentary appears in the Financial Times and the print India. Faisal Devji. Faisal Devji is Professor of Indian History and Fellow of St. Anthony's College, Oxford, where he is also Director of the Asian Studies Centre. He is the author of 4 books on militant ethics, global politics, Gandhi's nonviolence, and Pakistan as a political idea. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comments section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag us at @Jaipur Litfest. Ladies and gentlemen, we present to you Indian Political Thought in the Global Age, Shruti Kapila in conversation with Faisal Devji.
Well, Shruti, it really is wonderful to be in conversation with you about your really extraordinary book. And I hope I won't embarrass you by saying that, in my view, it is the most compelling account of the making of the Indian nation since Nehru invented that genre so many decades ago. But whereas Nehru's discovery of India traced the making of the nation from, if you will, fragmentation to unity, and if his opponents among the Hindu nationalists traced the fragmentation of that unity, which is given beforehand, to an increased state of disunity, you actually do neither of those things. For you, the unity is given almost, and the politics seems to emerge out of a pre-given unity. Could you tell us more about, how you came upon that thought and just elaborate it a bit?
Well, thank you, Faisal. It's such a great pleasure to be in conversation with you in public in this manner. And my thanks also to William Dalrymple for this invitation. And it's a great pleasure to be doing it for the JLF, albeit, virtually. So thank you. You do embarrass me by comparing the book to Nehru's discovery of India, partly because Nehru's discovery of India is almost discovering the very object of rule that he wishes to kind of mold in his own very compelling and very persuasive ideas. So in that sense, my work is not utopian in the sense that it doesn't project an idea of a polity that might come to be, even though it uses history. And many of our founding figures, whether it's Ambedkar, whether it's Savarkar, whether it is Nehru, of course, but also even Iqbal, on whom you've written that as well, that they all use history as a way of conveying political ideas. So the past is inescapable for the study of political ideas in India, because that's the preferred kind of genre, the preferred rubric to convey, what a polity might be. But the question of fragmentation and unity is an interesting one that you posit, because in some senses, it's a given, very much in the sense that even Ambedkar would say that, this is, India already exists, it already is a set of people. But so in that sense, I was never too vexed in the kind of imperial genre, right? The imperial genre is always, imperial history is always saying whether India was a nation prior to the British Empire giving it unity. But the interesting thing about the British Empire is that, its consolidation and its conquest is in the same areas as the Mughals. So, of course, I know that Aurangzeb is a very, very controversial character in India today, but it's really Aurangzeb's map, because it's really Aurangzeb who first kind of, in a way, after several centuries, unites, as it were, the Deccan, the South, with the northern heartlands. So I wasn't concerned with territoriality in that sense, because I took it as a longue durée, but I was interested, therefore, what exactly separation could mean between historical brothers, Hindus and Muslims, and what violence could have, what role violence has in the coming of new India, of this moment. Sorry.
You mentioned empire, and of course, in so many ways, even though all of your characters are engaged deeply with imperialism, in an anti-colonial mode, the empire doesn't really play much of a role in your book. It's a fundamentally Indian story. And in a way, this goes completely against the grain of so much contemporary history writing, which seems obsessed by the empire. And I wonder if you could say something about why the British, if you will, are an absent presence in your book. They are there to make the context of it, but they they only have a walk-on part.
Well, thank you. I mean, that was precisely the idea, to in a way also be authentic to some of the principles of my book. So whether the problem is precisely, say, for the opening actor of my book, Tilak, that the British are all too pervasive, all too powerful, and that the empire in the 20th century has entered its more permanent state, perhaps, precisely because it has depoliticized India completely, and that the state is, though small, incredibly powerful. So how to forge a new anti-colonial politics when, as it were, neither the means of violence are with you, nor indeed, nor indeed actually the co-optation of Indians into the British system is also kind of gaining social mandate, as it were. So the British, in some ways, in that sense, I'm following again figures. I'm being true to my figures. Whether it is Tilak, Ambedkar, Gandhi, and even Patel. They have actually taken their victory to be a given. So they are trying to kind of forge a future for India where the British do not exist. So it's truly post-colonial in that way, even though it would take another 40 years, say, starting with Tilak, it would take another 40 years for eventual independence and even partition to take place. So in that sense, the British are that kind of overwhelming context in which these principles have to kind of deny it its existential value, so as to kind of free up their minds to write a new future for India. So I think in that sense, I was following them. And I think since you mentioned the empire and current debates, it's really interesting when I've just had a debate in my faculty about where empire stands and the like in contemporary politics. It's really interesting that in India, the debates around decolonization are primarily being deployed. The terms decolonization and all are being deployed by, say, the acolytes of the current government, by historians who kind of want to undo the Nehruvian Compact. Whereas here, obviously, it's much more about the second generation Indians or South Asians more broadly, or various other kind of student bodies and people who want to kind of return to the story of the empire as formative for modern Britain. So I think we're seeing a divergence, though decolonization and the British Empire might be, the debates might be becoming global. They're servicing very divergent ends. But also in India, you don't see the visceral presence of the British any longer. It's not like people like Churchill, except that people are not going to be wound up about him in the way, people can get terribly, he's a divisive figure now today in British politics.
Yeah, I mean,
our divisive figures are figures like you have written about, say Gandhi, or, they are the ones who kind of evoke the kind of emotions that are evoked by the empire here.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I've often thought, that stereotyped remark by Marx has often occurred to me about history occurring the first time as tragedy and the second time as farce, and that the current decolonial moment seems in many ways farcical because it seems to elide the anti-colonial moment that you are writing about. And also, how interesting it is that in the period you're writing about, and so many of your characters, they are in the business of managing the British rather than the reverse, as far as I can tell from your story. They know that they are going, that the British are going to go, and they need to construct a future without them. But in the meantime, while they're still there, they need to be managed,
Yes, this is why I think that word transfer of power has damaged so much of not just scholarship, but popular writing, that somehow it is assumed that when the British left, it was a transfer of power. So whether it's the Marxists who use that word to say, well, India just really had a kind of, passive revolution, or as it were, British imperial historians and thinking, which actually thought that, well, here's a kind of polity that the British left for the Indians to squabble over. Whereas my story is saying, no, actually the Indian political actors who are thinkers in my book really fundamentally tore down, prized apart all the given languages, principally liberalism, but also Marxism, to a great extent, to write a new political compact for India. And that was not because they were simply imaginative or wanted to be creative. They had no choice. This is a society which is riven with diversity, a diversity which is also producing conflict and hatred. And, so it's a very different passage into, say, Republican democracy from say, the European story, where a kind of homogeneity of language, of race, if you will, but certainly religion, allows for, a kind of more simpler process. And whereas I think for whether it's Tilak, whether it's Ambedkar, whether it's Gandhi, you can never get away from this question of, distinction. And distinction is both, one of the ideas of the book is that it produces is a kind of intimacy that there exists, historical intimacy between Hindus and Muslims. But there is also, in this age of the new modern state, Republican order, democracy, the anvil of democracy, also produces conflict. And the book is really charting that departure also from the West, that in the way that the West's kind of passage into modern statecraft and modern Republican order was hinged on expelling, demonizing, making the foreigner into an enemy. Right? I mean, whether today it's the refugee, whether it's the immigrant, or historically the Jewish question, it's always the category of the foreigner that has animated Western political ideas or politics and political enmity. Whereas in India, precisely because of these, the reality or the context of it itself forges a new language also of political intimacy and enmity, because violence would also then be of meaning, existential meaning, not against the British, but against your own. So that's why the book starts with this premise that in 1857, Indians killed the British. 90 years later, they're singularly spared. So what happens? So that's really also a part of the divergence. And finally, not to go on, which is why also I think race doesn't come into it. The way colonial decolonization debates are so animated by questions of race, and certainly in the metropolis, in London and here, people like Gandhi and Nehru are certainly quite not agnostic, but certainly want to circumvent that category altogether as meaningful.
I mean, it's interesting you mention and contrast, Indian national politics to the making of nations in Europe. And as you were speaking, it occurred to me, might we therefore say that Hindutva politics actually takes its model from the making of the European nation state, insofar as that was about constructing a kind of homogeneity, whether religious, which was also the case in Europe in early modern times, or linguistic, or ethnic in more general terms. So that would make it, in a way, the most European project in Indian politics.
Well, it's a great question, Faisal, and I like it all the more also because, as you well know, that whether it's critics or even admirers of Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, certainly in the 40s, 50s, I mean, I have citations to that in it, in the book, compared itself to fascism. That has always been compared to fascism. And in my book, I argue actually Savarkar is doing much more than that. It's not fascism. Sorry, excuse me. It's not a kind of derivative realization of that kind of politics of race, soil, and blood. But it is an innovation around this problem of homogeneity. The fact that the problem for Savarkar is that India offers no testament of purity. So whether it is on the question of, monopoly of religions, like, India denies that to Hinduism, because there's also Buddhism, which is the crucible, Buddhism is born in India. And secondly, when he's looking to history for some kind of purity, in a way, a lot of people read Hindutva, which is in that manner, that it was a search for racial purity. But actually, if you read Savarkar carefully, he's actually saying, well, there has never been any purity. The history of India is a history of miscegenation. It is a history of mixture. And what Hindutva therefore does, according to me, it is a theory of violence rather than a history of an identity, because it then wants to kind of create what I call a violent fraternity, that it's only bloodshed, the anvil of war, which will kind of create a new fraternity. So whether it is European in that way, but it does or not, is slightly harder to agree with, because there's it has that kind of fantasy that there will be a kind of racial purity that can come through a new creation of a new polity or a new fraternity. But the problem for Hindutva is also its genealogy, which the book charts, which is its anti-statism. It is, that these are political ideas that are not at ease with the state form, modern state itself. And that's a tension we see all the way through Indian democratic polity as well, including with Hindu nationalism, and its inability also to control means of violence. So whether it's mob lynches today and the like. So I think yes and no, that yes, it wants a kind of pure racial singularity, which can only be produced through war rather than through history. But no, because there's a complete ambivalence on the work of the state and where violence resides in India.
And that's fascinating because, and of course, it resonates with the work that I myself do on Gandhi, the importance of the non-statist politics in modern Indian history. And it brings me to your fundamental argument about the subject as the site of sovereignty, rather than institutions, whether state-like or not. Could you say something about that? Why do you think the subject has become the real political, the bearer of political sovereignty?
Well, thank you, Faisal. In part, one can blame you because, for this, or kind of make you responsible, because in your own work on Gandhi, you make this very important point, in which I agree with, and then, I run with it in my own way, which is that, one of the ways in which Gandhi is important is that he breaks away from liberal ideas. So what does that mean? We all talk about liberalism and different creeds, but the idea that, the liberal creed, all the way from Macaulay, all the way from, has always been interested in happiness as an idea in the collective, but also in the idea that it's about the state, the modern state would be about the enhancement and the protection of life, right? Now, Gandhi, in a way, breaks apart from that, and he's really following Tilak there. that actually the question of life and death are fundamentally really individual human capacities. They cannot be given away to the state. The state might have its armies, it might want to run wars in your name, but as a kind of capacity, these are fundamentally, they belong to you and me. And as a result, also violence belongs to you and me. It is, you and I who will kill, and I think that's a very foundational change, because it takes away the abstract nature of violence and inheres it in the individual subject. It makes it very potent. It allows for exactly the figure of Arjuna to emerge as the kind of modular figure of politics. Tilak would say all political questions are Kshatriya questions, means they're warlike questions. And Gandhi would sort of steer that away from this kind of very violent vocabulary, but joining that principle that actually life and death cannot be just be taken away by the state, or they're not, they cannot be abstracted by the state. So he animates the project of death, actually. Because this is where the critique of Marxism comes, which is why Gandhi is so frustrating for the left, because, Gandhi is kind of saying, well, it's the one thing humans have. The death is the one thing which is beyond exchange. You can die for another person, but no one can die in your place. And this then animates his very, profoundly nonviolent politics, which, or the politics of restraint. I prefer to call it a politics of restraint, which you have written so well about. And I've only added a footnote to that, really, in the sense that, but that's really what Gandhi is doing. And Gandhi is important as a result, because he lays down, he just breaks apart the whole liberal edifice, imperial liberal edifice. But he foundationally, so this is not a deconstructive negative exercise, but he also foundationally lays down a kind of grammar for democracy in India, which, it exists. The farmers' strike today, shows after a year of kind of, powerful restraint. It's not a passive philosophy. It's a very power of restraint is very, it's empowered, it's strong. Can bring down the mightiest of governments. And that grammar stays. It might not be called Gandhian today. It might not even be recognized and owned up as Gandhian, but it is his language. It is his grammar.
Yeah, it has always struck me, and you and I have spoken about this before, how seminal the Gita has been to Indian political thought across religious lines. I am reminded, for instance, that Iqbal, who is also a character in your book, in the preface to his first major Persian work, the Asrar-e-Khudi, the preface is all about the Gita. And he writes about how the Gita is the most important philosophical discussion of human agency for action, available philosophically. And he lauds Krishna as the great thinker of action. And then he goes on to say that the problem arises when you have the distinction between Shankara, who he thinks takes the Gita in a bad direction because it's all about monism and unity, and Ramanuja, who he thinks is much better because he preserves, if you will, duality or separation at the heart of it. And you need that. And of course, you need that in more than one way. It can be a politics of enmity, but it can also be a politics of friendship. In either case, you need, if you will, a separation or a duality and individual sovereignty, because the choice, the decision, not a choice, has to be made. And so that brings me to really one of the really foundational category in your book, which is fraternity. And, as I was thinking about it, it occurred to me how, Gandhi, while he talks about brotherhood all the time, is also very keen at other times to shift from the category of brotherhood to friendship, say between Hindus and Muslims. Whereas someone like Jinnah, his rival, wants to shift from brotherhood to contract. So, it's not quite friendship, it could be friendship, but it's a
Marriage.
Yes, yes. So he wants a divorce in some ways, and then followed by. So they all circle around this category, which for you is a given category, and it's the political category. So what I wanted to ask is, if fraternity is the one of the three political categories that come out of the French Revolution in its slogan, liberty, equality, and fraternity, it's the last of them. What do you make of liberty and equality? My thought has always been that you can very crudely divide up Indian political thought into those who are partisans of equality and those who are partisans of liberty. Yes. And the liberty would be Nehru, Gandhi, etc. Liberty first, and equality would be Jinnah, Ambedkar, etc. Equality first. How would you approach? So this is one way of thinking about it, but if you could say something about this kind of the basic role fraternity plays.
I mean, I thank you so much. It's such a joy to talk to you, precisely because it goes in all these amazing new directions, but also allows me to talk about the book more generally. So in some ways, I would agree. Let me do the triad of liberty, equality, and fraternity first, and then I'll come to the Gita as well. So the thing is, perhaps being like a historian, I have actually divided up the problem of liberty and fraternity between time periods. I mean, I'm arguing actually that precisely because the principals take the actors, the key founding figures, take their eventual victory as a given, they're not interested in liberty by the 20th century. So the start off, as it were, the Swadeshi movement is actually about, and I think I also then make a second point that they get obsessed with not so much liberty, but sovereignty. Which is the questions of life and death, which is questions of state imperial control and the like. So in a way, liberty is something not simply deferred, it's either taken for granted, but then it's also under-theorized in the 20th century. And the key question in the 20th century is how to live with others, i.e. fraternity. And it's a given, only because, as I said, that is the historical truth and context of India. It's sheer diversity, which is forcing people to now ask, how are you going to live in this age of nation states and democracy? And that takes me to the second question, which is actually the fraternity question that becomes important, which is why the British are not killed, because it's about intimacy. It's about the reversibility between love and hatred. Why is this so potent? Why is the Hindu-Muslim question so important? Is because it is one which can be reversed from one state to another. It is not simply about making it external, as the British were to India. It is not internal external, but one of love and hate. And therefore it can move between that duality. And which is why the Gita also becomes important, because Gita is about the moral question of killing your own. And in that sense, whether even it's perhaps the Hindutva lot, but even the most kind of exclusionary figures, people who believe in exclusionary politics in India, are unable to deny the Hindu-Muslim question its intimate nature. And they can never call it the same thing. They can never do what the Europeans do to the Jewish question, which is to externalize it, to make it a question of the foreign. And the Gita is instructive, and I think I'm glad you mentioned the Asrar-e-Khudi in that manner. I mean, I wasn't aware of the preface, but I do have a kind of comparative discussion of it with the Gita in the book, because even Asrar-e-Khudi is also a dialogue between a hapless subject and the figure of Allah. And what to do when others, your enemies, in that case the Europeans, as opposed to the Muslim empires, are really enjoying the splendors of earth. And Iqbal is asking, so what are we to do? But the answers that the Gita and Iqbal will give on fraternity would be very different. But I would leave that for readers to read the book. But suffice to say that for Iqbal, it's the weakness of fraternity which causes war. And for the Gita, for the Tilak people, it's really the only question which is open to enmity is the fraternal one. It's only your brother, like in the Kauravas and who is open to this possibility of becoming an enemy. The foreigner is just that, a foreigner.
Yes, I mean, I've often thought that the passions are aroused by the kind of enmity you describe are the passions of betrayal, which are only possible because your enemy is your brother. Otherwise, you wouldn't have that kind of passion and sense of betrayal. But I want to move to Ambedkar, also an important character in your book, because I can see the question of fraternity and betrayal and intimate enmity playing itself out in the communal question, in the question of Hindus and Muslims. But the caste question seems to be a bit different, because there it isn't about fraternity, it's something else. What's going on there?
Well, thank you. That's such a generous question, since you probably know the answer much better. You know the answer. But I think it's interesting because Ambedkar is really foundational, because he steers this language of the individual subject as the bearer of life and death towards a more Republican order, if I can put it. So he's really the architect, not just institutional architect, but he's saying, who are the people of India? They're given. He's not arguing like the British that there is no such thing as the people of India. But he says, there's a problem. The people is a kind of category that presumes a fraternal order, like in the French case, and that, you kill off the monarch and the people will emerge as a unity through which then a popular democracy can be, based on. But he says, well, the problem is the opposite in India, that you can't kill the monarch, because the monarch is not a singularized figure. Questions of life and death, or what he calls the immortal sovereign, the person who holds, as it were, the questions of life and death most strongly in India is the figure of the Brahmin, dispersed throughout the social order as a monarchy. And so therefore, the problem with India is that it's not like the Hindus and Muslims. There is no intimacy between castes. In fact, the lack of intimacy, separation, is the highest virtue in Brahminical society. So how do you forge that? That's why so people have obviously seen Gandhi and Ambedkar as kind of antagonists in terms of caste. But it's not actually as simple as that, because, as you well know, Gandhi is no upper caste, figure for upper caste, politics. But that the way they see this question is incredibly different. Where does the transformation of the question of untouchability reside? And for Gandhi, it will be, keeping with his philosophy of individual will. That yes, you will need to break the taboos. You will need to kind of undo the caste taboos. Through Brahmins will have to do menial jobs, taboo jobs, and Dalits will be entering temples. So there would be a kind of mixture that takes place. And Ambedkar is saying this is just fantasy. This is never going to happen. But more importantly, he's saying you can't found a democratic politics on this basis. And so Gandhi, he would like to then end separation, the separation between castes, through reservations, through kind of creating a competitive politics around caste. And on the other side, he would seek the separation of Hindus and Muslims, through partition, because he's saying their violence has become too uncontrollable. It's not primordial. He's not saying that they were separate and meant to fight. He's saying actually this theater of the nation state has, unleashed their histories of power in a kind of competitive order. So the Muslims have a history of rule. The Hindus feel the need to kind of take over the polity. And this arena has made it a kind of violence which demands cooling off, literally separating. And whereas the problem is the opposite, that the castes are so separated. How are you going to create a kind of fraternal democratic society? And there the answer is an institutional answer as opposed to the Gandhian one. Well, you create categories of caste which will have to then be recognized by the law, for instance, reservations, and then you kind of undo India's undeclared civil war on castes through competitive democracy.
you think that makes Ambedkar into, in a way, as opposed to all the other figures you're dealing with, into a truly statist thinker, because, and maybe even a liberal one, because he institutes caste identity, and if you will, caste political identities. I don't mean, existential, through the state, through reservations, as interests, and that is not something Gandhi or Iqbal or any of the others are particularly keen on doing. So does that make you think Ambedkar into India's true liberal?
Well, I mean, I know that some would argue so, that he is a radical liberal, and I am more on the side of seeing him as a thinker of Republican democracy. I think, which doesn't mean that it's the same thing as the state. And it is particularly the case in India that the democratic story needn't be the state story, though, democracy would want state capture. Whoever wins, form the government. So I'm interested, like in current debates in Britain over Brexit and all, over the distinction between government and democracy, or state and democracy. And I think Ambedkar is the perfect thinker for the 20th century, not just for India, onto this question. So I would place him much more as a thinker of a kind of radical, agonistic, if I can use the word, democracy, where, in group interests or religious identities are not sublimated through some multicultural fix. We all must be nice to each other because we are good, good people, but rather that they are institutionalized as adversarial politics from the get-go, which means that, there is a kind of conversion of violence into non-violence. So I think of him as a non-violent thinker as a result. I also think of him as a thinker of a kind of very radical democracy, but also the flip side of it is that there is no exit out of such a politics. So how do we now create a politics of conviction in India, which is not the Hindutva politics alone? And I think this is a central problem for India's now mature democracy, because if you look at India's multi-party democracy, so of course Hindu nationalism is, we all know what it is, but the multi-party, the end of kind of Congress hegemony comes from caste politics. I mean, communists always existed, but the big moment in the 90s, but also going from the 70s onwards, is caste. And most parties in India are, by and large, caste parties, represent. And that, in a way, is a kind of Ambedkarite logic of Republican democracy in India. And now the question is and I think this is the question for the Congress today, how do you forge a politics of conviction when you have these blocks which are competitive, democratic, but also, I would say, hemmed in, imprisoned, I would say, in their own group affiliations.
And that's it's really fascinating, because you can see how Ambedkar, as it were, had already prefigured so much of this. From his book on Pakistan, you actually have partition, you displace the communal question, and the caste question becomes central to the Indian Republic. As you say, from the 1990s, it transforms Indian democracy. And, we then have to wait to see what happens next. But what interests me in that prefigurement is how he relies upon, and I was reminded of this when you talked about a cooling off period, because the temporariness of so much of the constitutional measures that were proposed in late colonial India, that, you can have a partition for a while, 10 years, and then see what happens. Or, a provincial autonomy for a while, or indeed caste reservations, which are meant to be for a temporary period, or language usage, say the role of English meant to be temporary. All of these have been made more or less permanent. But it's the kind of importance of the temporary in constitutional thinking in India which I think is completely elided by the current batch of books on the Indian Constitution.
Well, exactly. I mean, thank you for saying that. And I think here the final chapter on Patel, for me, is formative, because it would be Patel at the height of the civil war, which is the partition violence as civil war, to argue against the Indian triumvirate, whether it is Gandhi, Nehru, or even to some extent even Jinnah, who's also prevaricating about what does partition really mean, in terms of its permanence and the like, because he's saying, well, Hindus can come, and can live in it at the very moment Hindus are leaving, the new states. But it's Patel, and which is why he deserves his reputation as the kind of original strongman of India, because it would be Patel in at the height of 47, 48, saying, well, this is actually now the permanent state of affairs. But this is the new reality. The unity of India, is going to be forged by this formative division. That this division is what now gives India a united entity, and it's and he prevails. I think the reason I think people in India feel very again very divided about Patel. He hasn't got his due, etc., etc. But of course, there's statues now, and he's always had his due. It's in fact, if anything, it's a mistake to think of him only in terms of the decapitation, metaphorical decapitation of the Indian princes. But he's actually really, really significant precisely for saying that this is the new order of being. And the wellspring of India's new sovereign status comes from Patel. I mean, and that's why I do not think the Constitution as formative for Indian democracy. It is. It gives the rules of the game to play. I actually am arguing that what happens in the Patel arena in between 46 and 48 is where it's at, because he will come in and say, well, Muslims now have exhausted any political rights that they could have got. And now the era of maybe Dalit politics can start, and Ambedkar, so there's a way in which Patel's imprimatur on India's post-colonial structure is deeper than simply him giving, the internal map of India for which he is remembered.
Well, thank you very much. I see our time is up, but it's a wonderful place to end with the Civil War and the end of the Civil War and Patel yes. and the making of a new India. So thank you very much, Shruti, for this really wonderfully illuminating conversation.
No, thank you, Faisal. Thank you for that very generous conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Shruti and Faisal, for this truly insightful session. And thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. Sessions are ongoing across all three of our venues, Frontlawn, Mughal Tent, and Darbar Hall. Stay tuned for our next session.